The room seemed to grow heavier with those words, the weight of what was to come pressing down on both of them. Mateo had lost his position, but Brian knew the man wasn't one to surrender without a fight. The battle wasn't over, it was just beginning. The removal of Mateo from Henry Plaza should have been a moment of triumph for Brian Henry. Instead, it felt like the eye of a hurricane, a fragile pause before chaos struck again. The knot in his chest refused to loosen, the weight of what could still happen pressing heavily on him. Grace sat nearby, her expression a mix of relief and lingering apprehension. "He's really out?" she asked, her voice tentative, almost disbelieving. Brian gave a slow nod, though the unease in his own heart mirrored hers. "Yes," Marvin confirmed it. "The board voted unanimously. Mateo's officially out." Grace exhaled, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, yet the worry in her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. She could sense what Brian wasn't saying. "So why do you still look like the weight of the world is on your shoulders?" she pressed gently. Brian leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his fingers raking through his hair as he tried to put his thoughts into words. "Because this isn't over. Mateo isn't the type to walk away quietly," he murmured, his voice heavy with concern. "Marvin said he left the hotel, but I know him. He's not done. He's going to retaliate." Grace's hands tightened together in her lap, her knuckles turning white. "But the board knows the truth now. They've stripped him of his power. What more can he do?" Brian shook his head, his stomach churning as he paced the small hotel room. "He doesn't need a position at the hotel to be dangerous. Mateo has connections, people who owe him favors, and now he's desperate. That makes him unpredictable, Grace. He's angry, and desperate people don't back down. They lash out." A year later, she said. Grace's face darkened, her anxiety evident. "So, what do we do now?" Brian stopped pacing, turning to look at her. His eyes were sharp, filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "We prepare," he said firmly. "Mateo is going to try something, I'm sure of it, and when he does, we need to be ready, one step ahead." Grace swallowed, her gaze shifting toward the window where the early morning light filtered in faintly. "But how do we even know what he's planning? He could go after anyone, do anything." Brian clenched his fists at his sides, the weight of the unknown gnawing at him. "We don't know," he admitted. "But we know how Mateo works. He's all about control, about maintaining power. He'll try to take something back, use Judy or whoever his partner is to create chaos. We stay close to the hotel, keep our ears to the ground, and look for signs." "But it's dangerous," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. "If he knows you're watching him, Brian, what if he comes after you?" Brian's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening as he met her gaze. "Then I'll face him," he said quietly but firmly. "We've come too far to stop now. This isn't just about us, Grace. It's about everyone he's hurt. We finish this no matter what." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with both fear and determination. Grace nodded finally, her trust in Brian clear despite the fear etched in her features. Together they braced themselves for the storm that was undoubtedly coming. The hours dragged on as Brian Henry and Grace waited, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Every passing moment felt like it was winding down to an inevitable confrontation, something that would either cement Mateo's removal or spiral into chaos. Brian's unease grew with every tick of the clock. He couldn't shake the sense that Mateo still had one more move to make. By late afternoon, they found themselves back near Henry Plaza, standing across the street to observe from a safe distance. The hotel had taken on a different air. Staff moved hurriedly, their expressions marked with tension, as though bracing for the fallout from Mateo's removal. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. Brian's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He quickly checked the screen. It was a message from Marvin. Mateo just left the hotel again. Be careful. He looked furious. Brian's stomach tightened at the words. Mateo returning to the hotel after being ousted wasn't part of the plan. Whatever the man was up to, it wasn't good. We need to figure out what he's doing, Brian said, turning to Grace. His voice carried a mix of determination and urgency. He went back for a reason, and it's not to pack up his office. He might be trying to sabotage something before he's completely out. Grace nodded, her face serious. How do we get in without tipping anyone off? The staff's already on edge. Brian thought quickly, his mind racing through their options. We'll go in as guests, he said finally. No staff uniforms this time. If Mateo or Judy see us, they'll know we're up to something. Grace hesitated, but quickly nodded. All right. Let's do it. They approached the hotel cautiously, slipping through a side entrance to avoid attention. The lobby was unusually quiet, but the tension was palpable. Staff moved briskly, their eyes darting around nervously. Brian's gaze settled on the front desk, where Judy stood like a sentinel. Her expression was cold, unreadable, but her presence alone was enough to unsettle the employees around her. She's still here, Grace whispered, her voice tight with worry. Brian's jaw clenched. Judy had been Mateo's closest ally from the beginning. She had enabled his schemes, covered his tracks, and maintained order through intimidation. Even now, with Mateo removed, she was clearly holding her ground, awaiting his next orders. We need to avoid her, Brian said under his breath. Let's head to the service corridors. If Mateo is still plotting something, that's where we'll find him. They moved swiftly and quietly, weaving through the lobby and slipping unnoticed into the service areas behind the scenes. Here, the tension was even thicker. The usual hum of chatter and activity had been replaced with anxious whispers and hurried footsteps. Everyone seemed to sense that something was unfolding, though no one dared to say it out loud. Brian and Grace exchanged a glance, their shared determination evident. They knew the risks of being caught, but they also knew they had to uncover Mateo's next move. There was too much at stake to turn back now. The narrow hallway seemed to pulse with tension, each second stretching uncomfortably long. Brian Henry's mind raced as he tried to piece together what might be waiting for them. Something wasn't right, and he knew it. Mateo had always been calculating, always staying 2 steps ahead. Now, with his plans unraveling and the walls closing in, he was at his most dangerous. Desperation had a way of making people reckless. Brian and Grace reached the service elevator. He pressed the button, his heart pounding as they waited in silence. The soft hum of the elevator descending felt unnervingly loud in the stillness. Despite their determination, Brian couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. But they had no choice. Mateo had to be stopped before he inflicted any more damage. The elevator doors slid open and they stepped inside. The ride to the top floor where Mateo's office was located seemed endless. Every ding of a passing floor felt like a countdown to the inevitable. When the doors finally opened, Brian and Grace stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. Brian's pulse quickened as they moved carefully toward the corner where Mateo's office was situated. Then they heard it. Voices. Low, intense voices emanating from the office. Both Brian and Grace froze, exchanging a glance filled with apprehension. It was Mateo, and he wasn't alone. They crept closer, staying hidden but positioning themselves to listen. Brian's breathing slowed as he strained to catch every word. I'm telling you, time's running out, Mateo growled, his tone filled with frustration and urgency. The board's breathing down our necks, and Henry's not letting up. If we don't act now, we're finished. We will act, another voice replied, calm but firm. Brian recognized it immediately. Judy. She was still firmly by Mateo's side, enabling him even after his removal. But we can't rush this. Moving too fast will only make us more vulnerable. Brian's stomach churned. Mateo wasn't backing down, he was plotting, and Judy was right there with him, preparing for their next move. Even after being stripped of power, Matteo was determined to protect himself in their corrupt scheme. "We'll deal with Henry," Matteo muttered darkly, venom dripping from his words. "Once he's out of the picture, we'll finish what we started." Brian's chest tightened. They were still targeting him. Matteo was determined to eliminate him as a threat, and from the sound of it, the plan was already in motion. This wasn't over. Grace turned to him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and resolve. "What do we do?" she whispered. Brian clenched his fists, his mind racing through their options. Confronting Matteo and Judy head-on wasn't possible, not yet. They needed to know more, to fully understand what Matteo was planning. Proof was the key. "We have to stop them," Brian murmured, his voice low but firm. "But we can't act blindly. We need evidence." Grace nodded, though the apprehension in her eyes was unmistakable. "How do we get it?" Brian pulled his phone from his pocket, an idea crystallizing in his mind. "We record them," he said. "If we can get them talking about their plan, we'll have all the proof we need to take them down." Grace hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "Okay, let's do it." They moved closer to the office, keeping to the shadows as they positioned themselves just outside the door. Brian held up his phone, activating the recording app, and then gestured for Grace to stay quiet. They listened intently. Matteo's voice was urgent, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "The funds get moved tonight. Once the transfer is done, there's nothing the board can do to stop us." Judy's reply was calm and measured, as always. "And Henry?" Matteo's tone turned cold, filled with a chilling certainty. "I'll take care of him. He won't be a problem for much longer." Brian felt his stomach twist at the sheer malice in Matteo's voice. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was personal. Matteo was desperate, and desperation made him more dangerous than ever. But Brian and Grace had the recording now, undeniable proof of Matteo's schemes and threats. Brian looked at Grace, his resolve hardening. They weren't going to let Matteo get away with this, not this time. With the recording in hand, they had the power to expose everything. The fight wasn't over, but they had the upper hand. The cold, calculated tone of Judy's voice lingered in Brian Henry's mind as he and Grace slipped away from Matteo's office. Each word they'd overheard replayed with a clarity that sent shivers down Brian's spine. Matteo wasn't just planning to transfer the stolen funds that night, he was prepared to ensure Brian wouldn't stand in his way. The threat in Matteo's promise to handle him was unmistakable, and the implications were chilling. As they hurried toward the service elevator, Brian's thoughts raced. The second recording was a damning piece of evidence. It confirmed Matteo's intent to drain the hotel's accounts and exposed Judy's unwavering complicity in his schemes. But the stakes were greater than ever. Matteo's desperation had made him reckless and far more dangerous. Grace's voice broke through Brian's whirlwind of thoughts. "We have to get this to Marvin," she whispered, clutching the recorder tightly. "This is it. This will finally stop him." Brian nodded, his jaw set. But the pounding of his heart betrayed the calm exterior he tried to project. The timeline Matteo had revealed left no room for delay. If they didn't act swiftly, everything would unravel. Henry Plaza, his father's dream, the staff's security, and more pressingly, Brian's safety was now at risk. Matteo's intentions toward him were clear, and Brian knew all too well how far desperate men would go. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Brian and Grace stepped inside. The confined space only amplified the weight of their mission. The hum of the machinery was a faint background to the cacophony of Brian's thoughts, calculating their next steps. "We can't go to Marvin's apartment," Brian said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Matteo might already have people watching. We can't risk leading him to Richard or losing the recording." Grace's brows furrowed in concern. "Then where do we go? We can't just stay here. If Matteo or Judy see us—" Her voice trailed off, the fear behind her words clear. Brian exhaled sharply, his mind sifting through their limited options. "We'll head to the cafe near Henry Plaza," he decided. "It's quiet, and it's close enough for Marvin to meet us quickly. It's safer than heading straight to him." Grace nodded reluctantly, her grip tightening on the recorder. "Okay, but we have to move fast." As the elevator reached the ground floor, Brian peeked out cautiously before stepping into the corridor. The lobby was quieter than earlier, but a sense of unease still hung in the air. Staff hurried by with nervous energy, their eyes darting as though anticipating something to go wrong. Brian and Grace slipped out through a side entrance, their footsteps light and quick against the cool evening pavement. The city air hit them like a welcome rush, a momentary reprieve from the oppressive tension inside the hotel. They flagged down a cab, climbing in and giving directions to the cafe near Henry Plaza. The driver didn't seem to notice their anxiety, focused instead on navigating the quiet streets. In the back seat, Grace glanced at Brian, her expression a mixture of determination and fear. "Do you think this will be enough?" she asked softly. "It has to be," Brian replied, though the weight in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "We've got Mateo's plans on record. Once Marvin hears it, the board won't have a choice but to act. They'll freeze everything before Mateo can make his move." Grace nodded, her gaze dropping to the recorder in her lap. "But what about us? Mateo isn't going to just let this go." Brian swallowed hard, the reality of her words settling heavily in his chest. "We'll deal with that when the time comes. Right now, we need to make sure this gets to Marvin. That's the only thing that matters." The cab slowed to a stop in front of the cafe, its windows glowing softly against the night. Brian and Grace stepped out, scanning their surroundings before entering. The quiet hum of conversation inside was a stark contrast to the storm raging in Brian's mind. They found a corner table partially hidden from view and waited. Grace held the recorder close, her fingers gripping it like a lifeline. Brian kept his eyes on the door, his thoughts a blur of contingency plans and the looming confrontation ahead. "Marvin will come through," Grace said, almost as if trying to reassure herself. Brian nodded, his resolve hardening. He has to. They couldn't risk going back to Marvin's apartment, not now that Mateo likely knew they were on to him. The stakes were too high. They needed somewhere safe, somewhere discreet, where Mateo couldn't track them. Brian quickly pulled out his phone and typed a message to Marvin. "We've got more evidence. It's urgent. Meet us at the cafe near Henry Plaza in 30 minutes. As the elevator descended, Brian stole a glance at Grace. Her grip on the voice recorder was tight, her knuckles white. Her face reflected a mix of determination and unease. She was as on edge as he was. The closer they got to exposing Mateo's plan, the more perilous their situation became. "We'll meet Marvin, present the evidence, and have the board stop Mateo before he can transfer the funds," Brian said, trying to steady his voice. He needed to sound confident, even as anxiety coiled tighter in his chest. Grace nodded, though the worry in her eyes remained. "But what if Mateo figures out what we're doing before then? He's already suspicious, and if he finds out we've been recording him—" She trailed off, her words heavy with unspoken fears. Brian swallowed, his mind racing to push past the gnawing dread. Grace wasn't wrong. Mateo had proven he was capable of anything to protect himself. If he discovered their plan, the consequences could be devastating. "We'll be cautious," Brian said firmly, as much to convince himself as her. "We can't afford mistakes. We're too close to let this slip away now." 30 minutes later, Brian and Grace stepped into the quiet cafe near Henry Plaza. Its warm, dimly lit interior offered a stark contrast to the tension they carried with them. The cafe was mostly empty, with only a few scattered patrons sipping coffee or reading, their low conversations blending into the soft hum of the space. It was the perfect spot for a clandestine meeting. They chose a booth tucked into a back corner, away from prying eyes. Brian sat with his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the room for anything unusual. Every second felt loaded. The the weight of what they were about to reveal pressing down on him. Grace slid into the seat opposite him, keeping the recorder close. "Do you think he'll come?" she asked, her voice low. "He'll come," Brian replied, his tone resolute. Marvin had always been dependable, and they needed him now more than ever. Minutes later, the door opened and Marvin stepped inside. His face was tight with concern as he quickly scanned the room, spotting them immediately. He crossed the cafe in long, purposeful strides, sliding into the booth across from Brian and Grace. "You said it was urgent," Marvin began, his voice subdued but firm. "What's going on?" Brian didn't waste a moment. He recounted everything they had overheard in Mateo's office, laying out the gravity of the situation. Then Grace pressed play on the recording. Mateo's voice spilled into the booth, a damning mixture of threats, schemes, and plans to siphon the hotel's funds before anyone could stop him. Marvin's expression darkened as he listened, his jaw tightening with every word. By the time the recording ended, his hands were clenched into fists on the table. "This is worse than I imagined," Marvin said, his voice grim. "He's planning to move the money tonight. If he does, the hotel will be ruined." Brian nodded, his own stomach twisting with anxiety. "That's why we need to act now. If we don't stop him before the transfer, it'll be too late." Marvin's eyes narrowed with determination. "We'll stop him. I'll call an emergency meeting with the board. Once they hear this, Mateo won't have anywhere to hide. The accounts will be frozen before he can even make a move." Relief swept over Brian, though it was quickly tempered by the lingering sense of danger. They had the evidence, but Mateo was still out there, and with his plans exposed, he would be more dangerous than ever. "Be careful," Marvin added, his voice grave. "Mateo knows he's cornered now. That makes him unpredictable." Brian exchanged a glance with Grace, their shared fear unspoken but palpable. They had come too far to let their guard down now. Every step forward felt like walking a tightrope, but they couldn't stop. Too much was at stake. Henry Plaza, the people who depended on it, and their own safety. "Let's end this," Brian said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Once and for all." "What about Mateo?" Grace asked, her voice trembling with worry. "He knows Brian is a threat. He's not just going to let this slide." Marvin nodded, his expression grim. "I'll have security on high alert. Mateo's officially out of the Henry Plaza, but he's still got his network. We can't afford to underestimate him." Brian felt the tension in his chest tighten like a vice. They had the proof. They were finally in a position to stop Mateo, but the closer they got to the finish line, the more precarious their position felt. Mateo was desperate, and desperate men were unpredictable. "Meet me in the boardroom in an hour," Marvin said, standing from the booth with a sense of urgency. "I'll make sure everything's ready. Tonight, Mateo's reign ends." Brian nodded, though the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. As Marvin walked out of the cafe, he exchanged a glance with Grace. They were nearing the end of the battle, but the stakes were higher than ever. The walk back to the Henry Plaza was eerily quiet, yet the tension between Brian and Grace was palpable. Each step carried the weight of anticipation, as if the city itself held its breath for what was about to unfold. Brian's thoughts swirled, replaying everything they had uncovered: Mateo's calculated schemes, Judy's unwavering loyalty to him, and the danger lurking around every corner. Yet, amidst the fear, a steely determination began to take root. They were so close to bringing Mateo down, and Brian couldn't afford to falter now. As they approached the towering Henry Plaza Hotel, the neon lights reflecting in the darkened streets, Brian felt the enormity of the moment settle over him. This was it, the culmination of weeks of planning, countless risks, and relentless pursuit of the truth. Grace walked beside him, silent but resolute. Brian could see the strain in her face, the quiet resolve in her eyes. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low but firm. "Tonight we finish this." Grace nodded, clutching her bag tightly as they stepped through the hotel's side entrance, slipping unnoticed into the familiar service corridors. Each step brought them closer to the final confrontation with Matteo. The endgame had begun, and there was no turning back now. Brian's phone buzzed, the message from Marvin illuminating the screen. Board meeting confirmed. Bring the recording. Brian took a steadying breath, his pulse hammering in his chest. This was the moment they had been working toward. The chance to expose Matteo's corruption and finally free the Henry Plaza from his iron grip. Victory felt within reach, but it also carried the weight of uncertainty. Would Matteo make his last move? As Brian and Grace approached the hotel entrance, an inexplicable tension settled over them. The lobby, usually bustling even in the late evening, was strangely quiet. The faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than usual, the stillness wrapping around them like a shroud. Brian's instincts screamed that something was off. Moving with purpose but caution, they made their way toward the staff corridors leading to the boardroom. The weight of the recorder in Grace's hand seemed to mirror the enormity of the evidence it contained. This was their trump card, the undeniable proof of Matteo's schemes. Rounding the corner near the elevators, Brian stopped abruptly, his heart lurching into his throat. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood Matteo. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow, the ambient noise of the hotel fading to silence. Matteo's gaze locked onto Brian's, his face a mask of fury. His eyes burned with a dark intensity, the kind that spoke of a man who had lost everything and who was ready to do whatever it took to salvage what little remained. Grace froze beside Brian, her breath catching as the reality of the moment sank in. Matteo's presence wasn't just a coincidence. He had been waiting, anticipating their next move. And now, seeing them here, the truth dawned on him. Matteo knew exactly why they were heading toward the boardroom. The air between them felt electric, charged with the clash of conflicting wills. Brian's mind raced, calculating his options. They had come too far to turn back now. The evidence in Grace's hand could dismantle everything Matteo had built, but they would have to make it past him first. The hallway stretched like a battlefield, the distance between them seeming insurmountable. Brian could see the shift in Matteo's posture, the predator sizing up his prey. There would be no reasoning with him now. This wasn't about the hotel anymore. This was personal. Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. Brian's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening. They were out of time, but they weren't out of options. He looked at Grace, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. We keep moving. We don't stop. Not for him. They had the truth. They had the power. And Brian Henry wasn't about to let Matteo take that away. Matteo stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly, radiating fury. Henry, he growled, his tone as sharp as a knife. You really think you've won? Brian felt his stomach churn, but he refused to back down. He held his ground, his eyes locked on Matteo's. It's over, Matteo, he said firmly. We've got the recording. The board is meeting tonight and they'll hear every word. Matteo's lips curled into a cold, dangerous smirk. His eyes glinted with malice. You think that little recording is going to change anything? You're just like your father, too soft to handle what needs to be done. Brian felt a flash of anger surge through him, but he quickly forced it down. He couldn't let Matteo provoke him, not now. He needed to stay calm, focused. This isn't about me, Brian said, his voice steady though his heart was pounding. It's about the Henry Plaza. You've been stealing from it, running it into the ground, and now you're finally going to face the consequences. The smirk vanished from Matteo's face, replaced by a simmering rage. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Henry, he hissed. You think you've won? I still have control, and I'm not about to let you or anyone else take that from me. Before Brian could respond, Matteo lunged forward, his fists swinging with the force of his desperation. Brian barely managed to step back in time, narrowly avoiding the blow. Matteo's movements were erratic, driven by anger rather than strategy, but his strength made up for his lack of precision. Grace gasped behind Brian, stumbling back as the scene unfolded. Brian's mind raced as he dodged another swing. He couldn't fight back. Not here, not now. Mateo wanted chaos, and Brian wouldn't give him the satisfaction. He needed to get Grace and the recording to safety. "Grace, go!" Brian shouted, urgency lacing his voice. "Get to the boardroom." Grace hesitated, fear flickering in her wide eyes, but she nodded quickly, clutching the recorder tightly as she turned and bolted toward the elevators. Brian's heart hammered as he sidestepped Mateo's relentless attacks. Mateo's fist swung wildly, his face twisted with unrestrained fury. "You think you can stop me?" Mateo snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You're nothing, Henry, just like your father, a failure." Brian clenched his jaw, the insult cutting deep, but he refused to take the bait. "It's over, Mateo," he said, keeping his tone firm despite the chaos. "You've already lost." Mateo's face contorted further with rage. He lunged again, but before his fist could connect, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. Both men froze for a split second, the tension palpable. Brian turned his head toward the sound, his breath catching as he saw Marvin approaching with 2 uniformed security guards at his side. Relief flooded through Brian as Mateo's wild confidence faltered. Mateo's eyes darted between Brian and the approaching guards, his bravado wavering. His grip on control was slipping, and everyone in the hallway could see it. Mateo's eyes widened as the realization hit him. For a fleeting moment, it looked like he might make a desperate attempt to flee, but he was out of options. The guards moved swiftly, grabbing hold of him as he thrashed against their grip, his face twisted with fury. "You think this is over?" Mateo roared, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll regret this, all of you." Brian Henry stood rooted in place, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breath. The sound of Mateo's enraged shouts reverberated through the hallway, his words a chilling reminder that even as he was being dragged away, his threat wasn't entirely extinguished. The man's sheer hatred was palpable, and it lingered in the air like a storm refusing to pass. Brian exhaled slowly, running a shaky hand through his hair in an attempt to calm the adrenaline still coursing through him. He had braced himself for resistance, but witnessing Mateo's complete loss of composure had been far more unsettling than he anticipated. The raw, personal nature of Mateo's threats struck a nerve, making it clear that this wasn't just about losing power or the hotel. Mateo wanted revenge, and Brian knew that the man would have stopped at nothing if given the chance. As the guards hauled Mateo out of sight, Brian felt a small measure of relief. The immediate danger was gone, but the weight of everything that had led to this moment and the potential fallout still hung heavy on his shoulders. Mateo had wreaked havoc on the Henry Plaza, eroding trust, exploiting the staff, and nearly destroying his father's legacy. Now, it was up to Brian to pick up the pieces. Grace approached cautiously, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Brian nodded, though his mind was still racing. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice quieter than he intended. "It's finally over." But even as he said the words, Brian knew they weren't entirely true. Mateo's removal was a victory, but it wasn't the end of the story. There was still damage to repair, trust to rebuild, and the shadow of Mateo's actions to contend with. Grace placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We did it," she said, her tone carrying a mixture of relief and determination. "The board will hear everything. They'll see the truth." Brian turned to her, grateful for her steadiness in the chaos. "Yeah," he said, his voice firming. "This wasn't just for me. It was for everyone, for the staff, for the hotel, and for my dad." Together they stood in the quiet hallway, the echoes of Mateo's shouts fading into silence. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in months, Brian felt a glimmer of hope. Mateo's reign of terror was over. Now, it was time to rebuild. Grace hurried back from the elevators, her face pale but resolute. She had managed to reach the boardroom, deliver the critical recording to Marvin, and return just in time to witness the final moments of Mateo's arrest. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice edged with concern as she approached Brian. Brian nodded, though his heartbeat still thundered in his chest. "I'm fine," he said, his tone steady despite the whirlwind of emotions churning inside. "But Mateo, he's not the kind of man who lets things go." Grace's expression darkened, worry flickering in her eyes. She didn't respond immediately, instead reaching out to place a comforting hand on Brian's arm. Her touch was steadying, a silent reminder of everything they had endured together. "We did it, though," she said softly, her voice carrying both relief and caution. "The board has the recording. Mateo's out. He can't hurt Henry Plaza anymore." Brian exhaled slowly, nodding. "I know," he admitted, "but the way he looked at me..." His words faltered as the memory of Mateo's venomous glare resurfaced. "He won't stop. Even with him gone, it feels like there's still a shadow hanging over all of this." Grace tightened her grip slightly, her gaze locking with his. "We'll be vigilant," she said firmly. "Mateo is finished, and you've got Marvin and the board behind you now. We've done everything we could." Brian knew she was right. The evidence they had risked everything to gather, the tense confrontation and the board's decisive action to remove Mateo, it was the outcome he had fought for since the day he decided to uncover the truth. But now, as the adrenaline drained from his system, the weight of the entire ordeal pressed down on him. The months of deception, the fear, and the constant strain had taken their toll. They had won this battle, but Brian couldn't shake the sense that the fight was far from over.